Welcome to Soama Media.
This video is not meant to attack any culture, belief system, or people. It is an invitation to question history respectfully, to compare sources, and to think critically about how knowledge is shaped, preserved, or sometimes silenced. Understanding the past does not divide us, misunderstanding it does. When Cheikh Anta Diop wrote The Origins of the Egyptians, he wasn't trying to provoke controversy. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was asking scholars to be honest. Diop entered a field where conclusions had already been decided long before the evidence was examined. For generations, mainstream Egyptology had quietly promoted the idea that ancient Egypt was somehow separate from Africa culturally, linguistically, and racially. Egypt was presented as a mystery civilization, almost floating above the continent it physically sat on. Diop challenged that illusion head-on. Using physical anthropology, linguistic comparison, classical writings, cultural practices, and even laboratory science, he argued one central point: ancient Egypt was an African civilization, rooted in Black African populations from the very beginning. Not as a late influence, not through migration afterward, but at its foundation. What makes Diop's work powerful is not emotion, it's method. He didn't rely on opinion. He relied on measurements, preserved melanin in mummies, blood group studies, skeletal proportions, and testimony from ancient Greek and Roman writers who lived closer to ancient Egypt than modern scholars ever will. And those writers, Herodotus, Aristotle, Strabo, Diodorus, Lucian, all described Egyptians the same way: dark-skinned, thick-lipped, and African in appearance. Yet somehow, centuries later, textbooks began saying the opposite. That contradiction is where Diop asks the uncomfortable question: if the ancients saw Egyptians as black, and the Egyptians called themselves black, who changed the story and why? One of the most striking parts of the document is linguistic. The ancient Egyptians called themselves Kemet, the black people. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The hieroglyph use meant charcoal black, not soil, not shadow, not poetry, but blackness itself. Later scholars attempted to soften this by translating it as black land, referring to the fertile Nile soil. But Diop explains that the grammatical structure of the language doesn't support that interpretation. When Egyptians referred to their land, they used different constructions. When they referred to themselves, they used Kemet, the people. This matters, because language doesn't lie easily. People don't misname themselves for thousands of years. Diop also points out something modern minds often forget: Africans did not define themselves by skin color the way Europeans later would. Egyptians did not call Nubians black to separate themselves because both belonged to the same physical world. Differences were cultural, not racial. Race obsession came later. And that's where this work begins to mirror our present. Today, we live in a world shaped by labels: black, white, mixed, immigrant, native, yet many of these categories were created not to explain humanity, but to rank it. Diop shows how 19th and early 20th century anthropology bent science to justify hierarchy. Skull measurements, nose angles, facial indexes, all were used selectively to prove European superiority, even when the same methods would classify modern Europeans as Negroid if applied consistently. In other words, the rules kept changing depending on who was being measured. That pattern hasn't disappeared. Today, we see it in algorithms, education systems, media narratives, and even spirituality spaces where African knowledge is often renamed, rebranded, or stripped of its origin before being accepted. Yoga becomes universal. Meditation becomes mainstream. But African cosmology, that still gets labeled primitive. Diop's work quietly exposes that contradiction. He also connects Egypt to wider Africa through culture, circumcision, totemism, spiritual symbolism, kingship rituals, and ancestral continuity practices still found across the continent today. This is important because modern narratives often treat Africa as if it has no intellectual lineage, as if wisdom only entered the continent from the outside. Diop flips that entirely. He argues that Egyptian civilization is to African culture what Greco-Roman civilization is to the West, a foundational root, not a borrowed one. That idea alone reshapes identity. And here's where it touches modern life deeply. When people feel disconnected from history, they become easier to control. When a people are told their ancestors contributed nothing, they begin to doubt their own potential. When origin stories are erased, self-worth slowly follows. You can see the effects today in education gaps, in spiritual confusion, in identity crises, in people searching everywhere except where they come from. Diop wasn't arguing for racial pride over others. He was arguing for historical balance. Because truth doesn't erase anyone, it simply restores what was missing. What's powerful is how calm his conclusion is. He doesn't call for revenge, dominance, or replacement. He calls for truth as reconciliation. He says only a history built on truth can unite humanity, because false harmony always cracks eventually. And maybe that's the deepest message for today. In an age of misinformation, emotional reactions, and surface-level debates, Diop reminds us that liberation doesn't come from shouting louder, it comes from understanding deeper. Knowing who you are doesn't make you superior. It makes you grounded. And grounded people don't need to prove themselves, they simply stand. If this perspective made you think, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments.
Garantani. Till the next video.